and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dan Sutter, with the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. The threat of monopoly emerged in the U.S. economy in the late 1800s, with corporations of a national scope emerging on the national economy, and this led to the passage of landmark federal legislation. Since the late 1970s, a quiet revolution in antitrust has emerged, with states to an increasing extent enforcing federal antitrust laws. But what incentives do state attorney generals have in undertaking such suits? And might the suits be used to help launch a political career instead of promoting competition and consumer welfare? Joining me to discuss a recent paper he published on this topic is my colleague from the Johnson Center, John Dove. John, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
So to get started here, let's talk a little bit about what is the role of attorney generals in the United States. What types of duties do they have?
Sure. State attorneys general, or state AGs, they actually historically developed from English, the English system, representing the English throne, and carried through the colonies, with many states adopting them in their first constitutions. Effectively, what they've historically been there for and have continued to do is act as legal advisors and legal counselors to state agents, also many times representing the state within state and federal court anytime a suit might be brought or there might be some case or issue brought up. A number of state AGs are also charged with many times reviewing and providing briefs on the potential constitutionality of certain legislation or regulation across the states. And
then let's talk a little bit about antitrust too, because I'm sure people are familiar with the term, but maybe a little less familiar about exactly what antitrust serves. So amongst economists, what's sort of the conventional rationale that's offered for antitrust laws?
Sure. So the idea behind antitrust is to effectively break up or decrease the potential for monopoly, where the economic argument about monopoly and the problem with monopoly is that when you have a single provider or very, very few providers of a certain good or service, then it's possible for those providers to increase price on consumers, which leads to reductions in consumer welfare, and to also restrict output, many times reducing overall quality and effectively leading to detrimental outcomes for the economy at large.
Now, antitrust laws were adopted, so the first one was adopted back in the late 1800s, the Sherman antitrust law. We have the state, Ohio state historical plaque or marker for the Senator John Sherman. But
that's right.
So the laws first emerged over a century ago, but it's a number of economists, especially economists who believe in free markets, are somewhat skeptical of either the need for or practical application of antitrust laws. So what is this? Why are some economists skeptical about the value of these laws?
Sure, there are a number of reasons why it is that antitrust laws may not have or may not serve their intended purpose. Again, the first issue that you have is, many times enforcement is within a political context. These decisions aren't made within a vacuum. There are certain incentives and constraints that those individuals enforcing these laws face, and they'll react predictably to them. Other problems that you have, or may potentially have, is that many times when you look at antitrust laws or antitrust enforcement, what's actually being viewed is just one point in time, right? So it's just this static idea, where it may be the case that as a result of, say, a merger between two companies, for example, yes, that may increase monopoly power, if we think about something like that, and may initially lead to higher prices. But then the question is, well, what happens over time? Over time, we would expect to see cost efficiencies emerge through many of these mergers, which would reduce those prices. Also, outside competitors would begin to enter the market. So again, the important thing is to think, well, what happens in a dynamic sense? What happens over time? Not just this one point in time, which the law, unfortunately, has a tendency to focus on. There's also another big issue, which economists try to stress, is the idea of a contestable market. In other words, the threat of competition is competition. That's a very important concept that these laws many times don't account for. Now, this has changed over time, but especially traditionally, it's something that nobody's considered.
And many times, I believe other companies bring the bulk of antitrust suits. So it's one company filing a suit against another company, and not necessarily the state attorney general or the federal Department of Justice bringing antitrust action, right? So a lot of times companies use this as a way to protect themselves against competition.
Exactly, that's exactly right. You look at something like the Microsoft case, for example, where the first entity to actually bring the case was Sun Microsystems, which was Microsoft's direct competitor. And again, it makes sense that a competitor would try to bring an antitrust suit case, especially if you can recover treble damages, because by increasing your competitor's costs, well, it puts you at a competitive advantage.
And it could certainly help chill any firm that might be able to undercut prices if there's a danger that they could be charged with setting their prices too low, or an intent to try to monopolize the industry.
That's exactly right. Just like antitrust deals with, well, is the price set too high? Is it a monopoly price? Well, you could also have a situation where you may be considered acting as a predator, right? Predatory pricing, where you're actually setting your price too low, trying to undercut your competition.
Now, one of the things that's been happening relatively under the radar in antitrust has been this switch from federal enforcement of the laws to more of a state-based enforcement. And so you could talk a little bit about the changes that have been happening in antitrust over the past several decades.
Sure, yeah. Again, most state enforcement that we do see emerge actually comes from those state attorneys general. Now, historically, the interesting thing is when you look at antitrust, those laws actually, the first antitrust laws were state laws.
Okay.
The federal law actually came after several states had implemented their own antitrust laws. So what we see really from 1890 with the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act up until really the mid-1970s was that states had almost no role in antitrust enforcement at all. Even though the laws were on the books, they didn't enforce. It was a federal issue largely. Well, we see in 1976 two major federal pieces of legislation, the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act and then the Crime Prevention Act, both passed. What the Crime Prevention Act did was actually grant state AGs the opportunity to pursue antitrust actions under federal antitrust laws, and also provided seed money to implement and begin antitrust divisions within their offices. And then the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act provided what's known as Parens Patriae authority to these state AGs, where Parens Patriae is parent of thy country. It effectively allowed state AGs to bring what are class action lawsuits under antitrust laws.
So they bring these suits on behalf of consumers, or
Yes.
allegedly in the name of consumers?
Exactly right. Acting as the individual overseeing these laws for consumers and constituents within your state. Yes, you bring them on behalf of those constituents.
Now, a number of economists in the public choice school have certainly looked at the sort of the politics of antitrust over the years. But I guess a natural extension of this then would be to look at the question of what incentives would a state attorney general have to bring these types of suits. And so I guess the first thing we want to ask, because one of the things that your paper looks at is whether electoral effects or considerations are affecting state attorney generals' decisions here. And so I guess we want to start with asking, are all attorney generals elected? I know our Alabama attorney general is.
Right, and actually there are 43 states that elect their attorneys general, and then 7 states have some method of appointment, where 5 of them are gubernatorial appointment. One of them is actually appointment by the state Supreme Court, that's Tennessee, and then Maine actually appoints by a secret ballot of the state legislature.
Okay, so there's several options, but mainly just appointment versus election.
Yes.
Now, I think many people would normally assume that if being able to elect an attorney general or vote on an office like that would be very important, because you could vote to either approve or disapprove of the attorney general's actions. But there's one version or one argument that can be raised in public choice theory to suggest that even if the governor was going to be appointing the attorney general, almost like this, whatever political considerations would arise in an AG's election could end up being factoring into the governor's decision. And so appointment may not necessarily bring different results, right?
Sure, that's exactly right. Just like we would think that, okay, with an election for a state AG, individual constituents and voters can sit there and observe what it is that the AG is doing. Well, we would think then that also through the arm of the governor that's appointing, well, you can observe his behavior and you're voting for certain preferences and certain things that you want him to do, him or her to do, so that you would hope then that an individual is appointing somebody that would then carry out those preferences.
So if the governor can appoint somebody who is going to do their bidding and then also is worried about the same kind of issues that would arise in the AG's election, it might end up being the same thing. But then there's also a view that would suggest that maybe there is an important difference between appointment versus election, right?
Sure, there definitely is, especially if you look at something like state AGs or just election versus appointment in general. But state AGs definitely, elected state AGs have much more discretion over what it is that they can and can't do as far as enforcing not just antitrust, but just the laws in general, what sort of actions that they pursue versus appointed AGs who may actually have preferences that are more directly aligned with the individual that's appointed them.
And so it's something of an open question as to whether or not election versus appointment would actually matter.
Certainly, definitely.
And then there's also the question of how electoral considerations, if you're an attorney general and you do have to periodically run for election or run for re-election, or as you look at in your paper as well, the possibility that you might be looking to move from the attorney general's office, say, to the governor's office, that you have to look and say exactly what kind of incentives does this election give us state attorneys general, and do those incentives align with really sort of protecting consumer interests to the extent that enforcing the antitrust laws really would be in the consumer's best interest. I know we've already raised the possibility that from the dynamic standpoint these laws might be unnecessary in the first place, but there is the question of to what extent would the electoral process give good incentives to an AG to enforce antitrust laws, right?
Sure, to the extent that it would provide good incentives are the incentives where you're actually doing what it is that voters want you to do. If those are the policies that they want you to pursue, and if they're going to keep you in office by protecting their interests against potential monopoly, then again, we would hope that that would come out through the policies that an AG pursues. Again, there is also the flip side of that, which is just like you and I react to the incentives and constraints that we face, so do political actors. An attorney general is a political actor like any other. And so a number of those incentives, the biggest incentive that any political actor has is how do I get elected or how do I stay in office? And well, the way to do that is to get the votes necessary for that to happen. And so one of the biggest ways that you can do that is to try to accrue benefits onto your constituents without also simultaneously imposing a number of costs on them.
And you also need to have some publicity to be able to run for, say, the governor's office or for Congress.
That's exactly right.
And being involved in an antitrust suit and thus being probably interviewed on the news every day could be an important way to get that salience as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. One great example I have of this, I remember I was out at a conference in Nevada and I was watching TV, and it was Brian Sandoval, who's currently the governor of Nevada. He was running at the time, and he had actually been appointed to a federal judgeship. And he decided to come back and run for governor. Well, he had previously been the state AG, and his entire ad was all about everything that he did as the state AG, all of the actions he took, with nothing about the fact that he had been a federal judge. Just, these are all the things that I've done for you, remember this and come vote for me. And this has been an issue that we've seen increasingly at the state level, where a number of state AGs, like you're suggesting, actually have begun to really use that office as a springboard into higher office. A number of AGs end up as governor or even into federal Congress.
the whole possibility that elections might end up giving either politicians or even judges improper incentives to make decisions isn't new in any way, because it's been raised a lot in public choice. There's a whole idea of a political business cycle that would suggest that macroeconomic policy might be tied to elections as well, and that's not unrelated to what you're suggesting here, right? So could you tell us a little bit about this political business cycle?
Sure, yeah. Political business cycles, it's this idea where we see changes in policy that actually come around elections, right? So they flow around those elections. A number of things that we might consider is, well, okay, so what happens to tax policy before an election versus after an election? If you're in an elected position, well, obviously an incentive that you might face is to try to lower tax rates before an election because, hey, that looks great for you in front of your constituents, but then try to raise those taxes afterwards. Or you might simply try to, if you have control over some portion of the budget, try to provide certain benefits to key constituents before the election and then change that afterwards.
Not unlike when Hurricane Sandy struck New Jersey right before the 2012 election, President Obama was there right in the aftermath to start handing out some assistance.
Sure, yeah, exactly. It's just like that.
Now, the study you did looked at the specific and the specific example here of a possible electoral cycle on state antitrust activity. So tell us a little bit about the study. It was published in this journal Business and Politics, a very prestigious journal. I think it's edited out of the University of California, Berkeley. So tell us a little bit about your study.
Yeah, so the study that I specifically looked at was just trying to address a number of the issues that we've been talking about. Well, we've seen that, especially since the 1970s, as suggested, really the cost for state AGs to try to pursue antitrust actions, especially federal antitrust actions, has decreased significantly. That's especially been a result of much of the federal deregulation that we saw in the 1980s, where there were changes in federal antitrust enforcement. At the same time, as I've suggested, state AGs have increasingly tried to pursue higher office, tried to pursue governorships, positions in federal Congress, things like that. So the potential benefit from pursuing these actions is also increased. And so what I attempted to do was, okay, given that fact then, and given the fact that we know AGs generally need to be elected to their position, well, what effect might that have? Might there be a political business cycle revolving around state antitrust enforcement?
So how did you go about assembling the data that you're going to need to look at this?
Through a painstaking process.
Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so
give us a little window or insight here on the kind of research we as economists do.
That's right. So the National Association of Attorneys General, or NAG, their acronym, they have compiled state antitrust actions going back through the 1980s, complete through the 1990s to the present. So what I did was try to look at, okay, so which states were actually involved in state antitrust actions that were specifically in-state actions. In other words, was I the Attorney General of Alabama, and there's a gas station in Alabama that we believe is increasing prices to monopolistic levels? Did I pursue an antitrust action against them? And then I also considered, well, okay, did these state AGs then pursue antitrust actions against out-of-state interests, similar to something like the Microsoft case, or a more recent one was the AT&T and T-Mobile attempted merger, which I believe 27 states were involved in. So did a state AG actually attempt to participate in one of those out-of-state actions, or did they actually take the initiative to lead an action against an out-of-state interest that then became an antitrust case involving a number of state AGs?
So what did you find in your study?
Yeah, so overall what I attempted to do was look at, okay, was an attorney general running for that office? In other words, were you running for state AG, or were you running for higher office, as we suggested, running for governor? And so overall what I do find is that generally, yes, antitrust enforcement does sort of follow that political business cycle, where we see the number of in-state actions actually decreases during election years. And then we also see that participatory action, multi-state participatory actions, where, again, if I latch on to a multi-state case with a number of other states, those significantly increase during elections. This is for both governor and attorney general.
And depending on the exact model that you had, so it was about a 25% increase, or 20 or 25% increase in the number of these actions against the out-of-state.
Yes, exactly. Right? The number of actions that's pursued against out-of-state interests increases significantly. Like you said, and like I found, was roughly about 25%.
And so there was also like statistically significant, and you were trying to control for a whole bunch of other factors that maybe there were other things that would happen in the economy that happens to be correlated with an election year. So you have to try to make sure that.
Right. I attempted to just tease out as many other things that could have been affecting this, to see specifically, okay, was this one issue, what impact did that one issue actually have? Correct.
Okay, so you also find an interesting effect of the parens patriae, I'm not saying that properly, but you found an interesting effect of that law as well, right?
Right, parens patriae actually would appear to increase multi-state lead actions. Okay, and again, that makes sense, where if we just try to think about it intuitively, parens patriae effectively grants class action status to antitrust cases. So I can bring that on behalf of all of my constituents against some out-of-state actor, which again, I mean, it's a costly endeavor. If I'm an attorney general, it requires real resources, but now at the same time, it also increases the potential benefit if I succeed in this case. So we do see that as a result, that increases overall out-of-state antitrust actions.
And AGs can have some control over who gets some of these benefits out of these lawsuits if there is a settlement or if they win the suit, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, there's CPRE is what it's called, which historically it's been applied to trusts that no longer have overseers or have lived beyond the means of what they were intended for. So what courts would traditionally do is try to find, well, what's the absolute next best alternative that we could use this for? Try to use it for something that has closely replicated its original intent as possible. Well, this has been adopted by state AGs who then can go out and through receiving monetary awards, especially if it's a parens patriae action where you have a number of individuals. Well, we don't know who you are. You haven't tried to claim any of these monetary awards, or the monetary award for you individually is so small it's not even worth giving to you. Well, that becomes then effectively discretionary money to be used by the Attorney General. A great example of this, if I could real quick, is Charlie Condon in South Carolina. He was a sitting state Attorney General, and he ran for governor unsuccessfully, but he actually settled with 9 West Shoe Company over an antitrust action, and through a CPRE distribution actually used those funds during his gubernatorial campaign to run anti-abortion ads across the state.
Okay, sounds like
not quite sure how that's benefiting adversely affected consumers, but
now there is a question of whether this electoral cycle actually ends up harming their economy or not. But there's actually, from an economic standpoint, a pretty good argument that we can make that these actions against out-of-state firms by a state attorney general against out-of-state firms are going to end up harming our economy. It has to do with who's bearing the cost versus who captures the benefits from these suits, right?
Exactly. And if you look at it, what I find really makes sense if you think about it. Again, if I'm an attorney general and I'm up for election, well, just like we said for any other elected position, you're going to respond to the incentives and constraints that you face. I want to accrue benefits to my constituents. I can do that by pursuing these multi-state actions, bring those benefits in and provide them to my constituents, but at the same time, they don't bear those costs. Right. I force those costs onto out-of-state individuals, those individuals that now may see job loss as a result of a lost antitrust action, or who may see higher prices or some change in price due to change in the cost structure of the firm, anything like that. My constituents don't directly bear those costs. Other people do.
And that corresponds or coincides with the fact that the in-state, the actions against the companies that are inside your state aren't going up. At the same time.
Exactly.
So you
really
see a
reduction on those in-state.
You are really trying to go after the money that's outside of the state to, in effect, bring it in. And that's not unlike what some results economists have gotten looking at the incentives of judges in just civil suits or tort cases, right? That,
exactly.
An elected judge seems to have the same type of incentive.
Exactly. Right. That's exactly right. Where you see not in-state judges, but elected judges versus other methods of appointment generally see provide much larger tort awards to in-state constituents, especially if it's a lawsuit brought against an out-of-state interest. Because again, those benefits accrue in-state and the costs are imposed on somebody else.
And there have been other studies to show that there are electoral cycles and that election considerations are affecting a lot of people's actions in the legal systems. And I think there's one study that looked at the effect of elections on district attorneys and whether they apply or had convictions that were later overturned due to DNA testing. So could you tell us just a little briefly about that, if you know?
I don't know a whole lot about that
Okay.
one, but yeah, you see the exact same incentive there, where probably district attorneys probably take on slightly more marginal cases in an attempt to convey to constituents that they're tough on crime. Which again, those constituents might desire that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're convicting somebody who actually committed a crime.
Mm-hmm. Well, just in wrapping up there, what do you think is the way to go forward, or what do you think are the takeaway lessons, or what we might do differently in light of this cycle in antitrust enforcement?
Yeah, that's an important consideration. The biggest thing to do is probably to better differentiate and delineate what it is that federal enforcement can and should do and what it is that state enforcement can and should do. Again, there's a good reason why it is that the federal government is responsible for interstate commerce and for regulating interstate commerce. And that should be specifically up to federal enforcers as well. So when it comes to federal enforcement, leave it to the FTC and the DOJ, the Federal Trade Commission and Department of Justice. If there are specific intrastate within the state actions that need to be pursued, that should be the specific realm of the state AG.
Well, thank you very much. I think this is an interesting conversation. I think it's an important point. And thank you. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.